Hello friends, welcome to my channel. And today we are going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. We'll cover its causes, effects, and we'll answer some common questions along the way. So if that sounds good to you, then let's get started. And our first question is, what was the Industrial Revolution? And this is actually pretty easy to answer because it wasn't really all that complicated. This led to the mass production of goods and an increase in trade. However, despite that simple definition, there's more to it than that. And one thing that people get confused about a lot is how do you know when the Industrial Revolution started and ended? Well, historians typically say that it started in Britain around 1750 and ended sometime in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Now, Britain was definitely the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, but other countries quickly caught on. And by the end of the 1800s, most of Europe, North America, Japan, and even some parts of Latin America had industrialized. So if you want to make sure you get your timeline straight, the Industrial Revolution happened between the 18th century and the 20th century. But why did this happen? What caused it? Well, there were many factors. First off, you need raw materials. You can't make steel without iron ore. And so places that had access to a lot of natural resources like coal and iron were better poised to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution. Well, secondly, you need new inventions. The steam engine and the power loom are two great examples of inventions that helped during the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, you need an abundant and cheap labor force. Where else but in cities would you find lots of people willing to work for not very much money? Now, having those three things doesn't guarantee that you will become the next great industrial powerhouse. And Britain definitely took advantage of some lucky breaks along the way, like how they discovered huge deposits of coal and iron in their territory, and also how they invented the steam engine before anyone else. But Britain was also ready to take advantage of these opportunities with an abundant labor force, a stable government, and a strong economy. And because of these factors, Britain became the first country to industrialize. Now that we understand what the Industrial Revolution was and how it started, let's take a look at some of its effects. And there were plenty of them. Remember, this is just a list of some of the most important ones. If you want to see a full list, check out my study guides. And our first effect is population growth. And that's right. During the Industrial Revolution, the world got a lot more crowded. This was mainly due to two factors: improved farming techniques and the availability of new medicines. These things led to longer life expectancies and more people being born. For example, in Britain, the population doubled from 8 million to 16 million between 1750 and 1850. And keep in mind, this isn't like today where people are moving to cities because they want to be near the action. No. Back then, people moved to cities because they wanted to work in factories. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people worked in agriculture. But now there were factories that were producing tons of goods, and that meant jobs. However, living conditions were horrible. Families lived in one-room tenements with leaky roofs and privy in the corner. They were surrounded by trash, and waste and disease ran rampant through the streets. In fact, children were especially vulnerable and often had to work long hours in dangerous conditions. Also, most of the new jobs were low-skilled and monotonous. All workers did was tend to one machine over and over again, and sometimes they did and even get paid by the hour, but instead got paid by the amount of goods they produced. So workers were constantly rushed and stressed. Life during the Industrial Revolution was not fun. Okay, our next effect is urbanization. This is closely tied to the last effect: population growth. In 1800, London only had about 1 million residents. But by 1900, London had about 7 million residents. So that's 7 times more people in just 100 years. Alright, another effect was the rise of middle class. During the Industrial Revolution, there was a growing gap between the rich factory owners and the poor workers, and so a middle class developed in between them. In the late 1700s, the upper class made up about 3% of the population. The middle class was about 15%, and the lower class was about 82%. However, by the late 1800s, the upper class stayed about the same at 3%, but the middle class grew to about 35%, and the lower class shrunk to about 62%. And once again, this isn't a coincidence. And this one might surprise you. How does making machines that produce more goods lead to taking over other countries? Well, here's how. First off, You need raw materials to make goods, and the industrialized nations were quickly running out of resources. Secondly, they needed new markets to sell their goods. And lastly, they needed somewhere to put their excess population. So they colonized other parts of the world to exploit their natural resources, to sell their manufactured goods, and to have a place where people could move to. Like, for example, European nations raced to colonize Africa because it was full of natural resources, and it was basically useless to the Europeans beforehand. Or how the British took control of India because they could grow cotton there, which they used to make textiles. Imperialism is such a big topic that I have an entire playlist dedicated to it. So click here if you want to learn more about it. Okay, another effect is environmental change. Making steel, textiles, and all the other goods of the Industrial Revolution required lots of energy. And that energy came from burning coal and wood. And as you can imagine, burning a lot of stuff has some negative effects. For example, since cities were crowded and didn't have good waste disposal systems, they just dumped their garbage and waste into rivers and streets. So rivers became polluted and smog covered the cities. Also, deforestation became a serious issue because so much wood was being used to fuel the furnaces. Now that we know some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution, let's take a look at some common questions that students have about it. And our first question is, what was the significance of the Industrial Revolution? Well, there were lots of changes during the Industrial Revolution. Basically, it was a transition from the primary and secondary sectors of the economy to the tertiary sector of the economy. Let me explain. The primary sector of the economy involves extracting and gathering natural resources like oil or farming. The secondary sector involves manufacturing goods from the natural resources gathered in the primary sector, like turning oil into gasoline or wheat into bread. Finally, the tertiary sector involves providing services to the public, like becoming a doctor or a teacher. Over time, as societies industrialize, more and more people move from the primary and secondary sectors of the economy into the tertiary sector. And that's exactly what happened during the Industrial Revolution. Remember, this was the time where people stopped working in agriculture and instead worked in factories. Our next question is, what invention was most responsible for the Industrial Revolution? And there's a lot of debate about this one, because several inventions contributed to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But if I had to choose just one, it would be the steam engine. Why? Because the steam engine provided the power that fueled the Industrial Revolution. At first, the steam engine was used in Britain to pump water out of coal mines. But soon people realized that they could use it to power machines. And that's exactly what they did. Soon they were powering looms that wove textiles, machines that cut iron, and eventually entire factories. Alright, and our final question is, how did the Industrial Revolution affect daily life? Well, it changed almost everything. Remember, this was the time period where goods went from being handmade to machine-made. It was the time period where agriculture shifted to an industrial economy, and where many people left their homes in the countryside and moved to crowded cities. The Industrial Revolution changed the world, and its effects are still felt today. Alright, that's what the Industrial Revolution. Click here if you want to review everything you learned today, or click here to watch one of my awesome videos. I'll see you next time.